Hello, and welcome to the San Antonio Book Festival's event featuring Amor Towles. Thank you so much to each one of you for waiting patiently a full year for this event. I'm thrilled that you're here with us. Tomorrow, we kick off the 9th annual book festival. As you know, we had to cancel in 2020, so this year feels extra special for our staff. In fact, if we were in person, I would ask you to please give a standing ovation to the book festival team, Clay Smith and Maritza Serlos. They not only brought you today's event, but they brought this year's festival with a record 200 writers and 100 plus sessions. I am so proud of this team. This past year has brought one hurdle after another, and this team rose to the challenge in spectacular fashion. Did you know that this year's lineup features not one, not two, not three, but 4 books that are currently #1 on the New York Times bestseller list: fiction, nonfiction, children's middle grade, and young adult. I mean, it's basically our best lineup ever. This time next year, we hope to be celebrating with you in person the 10th anniversary of the San Antonio Book Festival. But we need your help because we have so much more that we want to do for San Antonio, but we need your donations to do that. I say this all the time, and it's true. The book festival is a gift. It makes San Antonio better. And I know that sounds like something that I'm supposed to say, so don't just take it from me. We asked some of the strongest advocates that we have in the San Antonio community, school librarians, to tell you about the book festival's impact on students. So take it from them. We have a wonderful program for you. Enjoy Amor Towles. Enjoy the book festival this weekend. Thank you so much for waiting patiently for this event. And please support the festival if you love what we do. I can't wait to see you soon. Each year at the San Antonio Book Festival, some little-known magic is happening behind the scenes. Through our Authors in Schools program, we send festival writers to Title I schools throughout Bexar County to deliver presentations to children and teens. The festival provides a free signed copy of the writer's book to every student in attendance.
2 years ago, we had a visit from Erika Sanchez that was sponsored by the San Antonio Book Festival, and it was an amazing experience. It was actually the first large-scale authors visit that we've had at Jefferson. With the support of the San Antonio Book Festival, we were able to give out to each student that got to hear her a copy of her book, I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. We were also able to make sure that one of those books were in every English teacher's classroom, and that we had 5 copies on hand here at the Jefferson Library. And with those 5 copies, that book it's a bestseller here at Jefferson High School.
I deal with a lot of students who don't really care for reading. And in that moment, it showed me that the impact an author has on kids and actually meeting them, especially representation, seeing an African-American author, seeing a Latino author. When you see yourself in someone else's writing represented, it inspires you and it makes you want to seek more because it validates your experience, but also makes you curious about other people's experience. So it leads you to reading books about other backgrounds. And kids across our campus they were becoming really voracious readers and just wanting to take in everything. In April of 2018, Jason Reynolds visited Ed White. One of the best things was our library assistant. She took a candid shot of whenever the students were released. They literally swarmed him like he was like an NBA player or a celebrity. And that's not typically a response you would get from middle school kids when it comes to an author. And so that excitement was it had us as staff on the side just looking in amazement because our kids were thrilled to meet this person who had created something that they were reading.
Like everything else, the Book Festival's Authors in Schools program is happening virtually this year. But we're thinking ahead to 2022 and our 10th anniversary. We want to return with a bang, and we want this wonderful program to impact a record number of San Antonio's youth. We need your help to make that happen. Your donation will allow us to double the number of schools we serve so that more young readers can experience the magic of an author's visit.
And once the kids understand that a book is really somebody sharing their life and sharing their hopes and their fears and their dreams and experiences, they're more likely to pick up another one. And so I really just hope that people understand that that's really the depth of what bringing authors to campuses, what it does for kids, how it just inspires them and it motivates them. It changed our campus culture for reading completely. As a teacher, I'm forever grateful. I didn't know that I would ever see that or experience that. And I'm so grateful. It was probably one of the best experiences I've had in the 10 years that I've taught. So I'm thankful for it. And I know that our students were too.
This program of bringing authors to schools is amazing. The book festival bringing authors to San Antonio alone has been, I believe, life-changing for me as a librarian, and I know for others in this community as well. For the students to see those authors then, though, come into the schools, that experience cannot be underestimated. It is so powerful, and I believe it can change the landscape of our city and the opportunities of our youth.
Yay, I remembered to unmute. You know, it's not enough nowadays to speak eloquently. You also have to know which buttons to push. Beep, boop, pop. So if you can't tell from your screen, I'm Clay Smith. I'm the literary director of the San Antonio Book Festival. Thrilled finally to be here with you all. And I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Amor Towles, and then I will get back on screen after he talks for a little while to get him to answer your most penetrating questions. So just a reminder for everybody, place your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. We're thrilled that Amor Towles is here with us. He, as you know, we were supposed to feature him in 2020, right around this time of the year, and he stuck with us. So thank you, Amor. Amor's first novel, Rules of Civility, was published in 2011. It was a New York Times bestseller and was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best books of that year. The book has been translated into over 15 languages, and its French translation received the 2012 Prix Fitzgerald. His second novel, the one he's going to talk a little bit more about today, A Gentleman in Moscow, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 52 weeks in hardcover and was named one of the best books of 2016 by the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. In the summer of 2017, the novel was optioned by EOne and the British director Tom Harper to be made into a 6 to 8 hour miniseries. Having worked as an investment professional for over 20 years, Towles now devotes himself full-time to writing in Manhattan, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. His new book, The Lincoln Highway, will be released in the fall. So that's the official bio, but one of the reasons that Amor occupies such a special place among American writers is that he's a very popular writer who's also a really talented writer. You know, in my line of work, I talk to people all the time about what they're reading. And some people look at me kind of sheepishly when I ask them what they're reading, and they say, it's just a beach read. The thing about Amor is that his books are as popular as the beach read writers' books, but his novels are so much more thoughtful than theirs. He has a real talent for deep characterization, and he also has a talent for placing a reader into a historical moment that's different from our own with a real immediacy and credibility. So I want to thank Amor for talking with us today. And I also want to especially thank our honorary co-chairs, Connie and Sandy McNabb, and Lynn and Pete Seelig for sticking with us during the past year and helping us put on today's event. It really couldn't have happened without them and our event committee members. So just a reminder, put your questions in the chat box. I'll try to get those over to Amor. And here is Amor.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I want to thank Clay for having me back and for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate those remarks. I too want to thank the McNabbs and the Seeligs, particularly in a year like this, where in the last year, there's been so many unknowns, so many unknowables. To step forward and support an event like this, despite all of those unknowables, is particularly praiseworthy. So thank you. And I also want to thank all of you for logging on today. I'm sorry we're not together in person. What I thought I might do is I wanted to, almost in a conversational way, walk through a couple of moments in my life which ultimately percolated into the narrative of A Gentleman in Moscow, to give you a little bit of a flavor for how the creative process works for me. And so in order to do that, I want to start by taking you back to 1988. So in 1988, I had just graduated from college at Yale, and I was at Stanford in a graduate program. And while I was there, I had a job as the assistant to the curator of English and American literature, which was a great job because it meant that I was in the library every day. Now, one day in the library, I went down into the stacks to get a copy of Chekhov's short stories, his collected short stories. And as I went down and I was kind of going through the stacks, all of you who've navigated the library know how this works. You're moving closer and closer to your topic. So you're kind of going in the literature aisles, into the European literature aisles, and then the Russian literature aisle, and you take a right down the row, and you're moving sort of chronologically closer and closer towards your prey, your quarry, in this case, Chekhov. Now, as I'm getting closer, I'm reading the backs of the spines, thicker, trying to find the collected short stories. And I stumbled instead on Chekhov's collected letters. I'd never seen it before, so I take it off the shelf and I'm going through the collected letters, kind of looking at different letters, reading them while I'm standing there in the stacks. Now, towards the end of this book is a letter that Chekhov is writing to his sister back in Russia. At the time, Chekhov had gotten quite sick. It was late in his life. As most of you know, Anton Chekhov was a physician by profession. But at this point, he was certainly already a world-famous writer of both short stories and plays. He had gotten quite ill, and so he had gone to Germany with his wife to take the cure. And he is sending this letter back home to his sister, with whom he's very close. And in this letter, he says, basically, I'm so glad that we came to Germany. It was the right decision. The hotel's wonderful. The people have been so friendly. The food is amazing. And in fact, if you've never had German bread, then you've never had bread. And I'm feeling very much myself. I'm nearly 100%, looking forward to coming home in about a week so that you and I can be reunited. With much love, your devoted Anton. Now, at the bottom of this letter are two footnotes. And now the first footnote points out that 7 days later, Chekhov dies. Now, so he never makes it back home to see his sister. So this is sort of a bittersweet letter. It's really one of the last that he wrote in his life. But the second footnote is more intricate. And what it tells us is that the first collection of Chekhov's letters were actually published by the Soviets. Because while Chekhov died in 1904, it's quite a complicated process, particularly then, to compile and edit a collection of letters. Because picture that, Chekhov's letters are not in his hands necessarily. They're in the hands of people, not simply all across Russia, but around the world. And so solicitations have to go out. You have to track down the letters. You have to get them in-house. You have to edit them and read through the handwritten, all the various handwritings of him and those who's responded, and go through the editing process. So this is an extended period of time to accomplish this task. And it is well on its way towards completion, but not yet done when the revolution in Russia occurs in 1917. So Soviet academics end up inheriting the project, and they oversee its conclusion. And the first publication of Chekhov's collected letters is done under the Soviets' guidance. And so what this footnote goes on to point out is that when the collection of letters was published by the Soviets, the sentence in which Chekhov praised the bread in Germany was removed from the letter. Now, that really struck me. There were sort of a couple of things that I had an immediate impression about. The first was, this was my first window on just how extraordinarily attentive, as it were, the Soviet apparatus was, right? Because you picture this. How many books are being published in Russia in a given year? It's thousands. And here is this collection of letters, which itself is close to 1,000 pages long. And somebody within some bureaucratic office has read through to the very last page, because we were at the letter, which is really one of the last pages, in order to find a sentence which needs to be removed. There's something quite impressive in a very chilling way about the sophistication and the focus of this political apparatus that would go and hunt down that sentence in order to remove it. But the second thought I had about it was that it was also kind of my first window on how serious Russians take the written word. Because, of course, to have gone to all this trouble, it's because they really believed deeply that this offending sentence, any sentence, could in some way, small way, start to tear down the whole government, right? That's the point of having the censorship, is they view these sentences as dangerous, even when they're buried in the deep bottom pages of this collection of letters. So as I say, that was a window on sort of the Russian mind in that sense for me. Now, like any good graduate student, having been impressed by this letter, I Xeroxed it right there in the basement of the library, and I put it in my files. 10 years go by. Now it's 1998. And my high school English teacher, who I would have a drink with every year, we're talking, and I said, what are you doing this summer? And he said, actually, I'm thinking about going to Russia. I've never been. And I said, I'd love to go to Russia. And he said, well, come along. And this is the teacher who, at the age of 17, I read Dostoevsky with. So it's the person who I first read Russian literature with. That person who had a great influence on my life. So we go off to Russia in 1998. And the picture I want to set for you is we are on Red Square. Now, for those of you who have not been to Russia or don't know it well, Red Square is just a big tiled plaza. But on the right side, as it were, is the walls of the Kremlin. On the left is a very famous department store. It's 100 years old. And on either end of the square are famous cathedrals. At the far end is Basil's, St. Basil's, which is the cathedral with the onion domes, with the brightly different colored onion domes, which is basically what you see in the backdrop every time Putin is in the news. If you're watching CNN or Fox, that's the church you see. At the other end of the Red Square is a cathedral, which is much smaller and more simple, called Kazan Cathedral. Now, Kazan, and picture, I'm standing in Red Square. I'm standing in front of the cathedral with my guidebook. And so I'm going to tell you what I read. And so now Kazan, very famous cathedral, partly because it is probably the oldest cathedral in Moscow. It has very famous relics. So for hundreds of years, Russians from all across the country have made pilgrimages, not only to Moscow, but to this cathedral in particular, in order to enter the cathedral, bow before or kneel before the icons, and make their prayer for whatever it is that they're seeking from the divine, or to be comforted at minimum. But so the cathedral, as I say, is quite famous despite its simplicity for these reasons. Now, reading on, what I learned from the guidebook is that in 1938, which was in essence to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the consecration of Kazan Cathedral, the Soviets decided to tear it down. Now, the reason that they tried to tear it down nominally was to make a little bit more room on Red Square for all the parades and such. But of course, they were also poking an eye in the Orthodox Church. So there's a sort of a quick reminder of who was in charge, and that they were, if they wanted to do something, they would just go ahead and do it. Now, when they decided to tear down Kazan Cathedral, they approached a famous architect by the name of Peter Baranovsky. And they say, Baranovsky, we want you to oversee the destruction of the church. Now, understandably, Baranovsky is horrified. He says, you can't do it. This is a national monument. If anything, should be preserved and restored. It shouldn't be destroyed. But the powers that be make it very clear to Baranovsky that if he refuses to tear down the church, that it will not sit well with the government. And so Baranovsky capitulates, and he oversees the destruction of the church. Now, before he does so, however, in secrecy, he makes detailed drawings of the church, elaborate blueprints with every dimension determined, the materials that are used in the various parts of the church, the colors, all the various architectural details that you would have on a complete blueprint in order to build the church. He makes these drawings in secrecy, he tears down the church, and sets those drawings aside. Now, decades go by, and Baranovsky dies. More decades go by, and we come around to perestroika. And what happens is that at that point, as Russia is opening up again, this is in the 80s, the government decides, well, we're going to put a church back in the spot where Kazan Cathedral once stood in Red Square, sort of as a sign to the Russian people and to the world that we are going to be a little bit more open about religious society as a part of Russian life. And so they make this as a public announcement. Now, when they do so, a member of Baranovsky's family comes and knocks on the door of the Kremlin and says, listen, if you're going to build a church in the site of Kazan Cathedral, then you should know that I have the blueprints of the original church, which were done by my relative. And so the Russian government decides, okay, yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll build the old church in the old spot exactly the way it was when it was torn down. And that's what I'm standing in front of, this elaborate, exact replica of the original church that had been torn down in 1938. Now, I loved everything about that crazy story. And as someone who's interested in sort of Russian culture and Russian life, I loved, in a way, once again, the chilling lack of sentimentality that the decision of the Soviet apparatus was to tear down this church, in essence, in celebration of its 300th consecration. That sort of total lack of sentimentality and kind of, as I say, poking the finger in the eye of the church. Something coldly impressive about that. I love that the Russians, when they found there were drawings, were like, oh yeah, let's build it back just like it was. We'll put it right there. It's almost as if it never happened, is the way they think of it in that regard. And that happens throughout Russian history, certainly in the 20th century, which is that they're constantly taking something out and then putting something back as if it never happened. And we can sort of pretend like it, like that whole part in the middle, the 50 years where the oppression existed, we can just pull it out of the history books and everything's fine. But the thing that I loved most about this story, of course, was the figure of Peter Baranovsky. Because my reading of Russian culture, Russian life, Russian history suggests to me that time and again, including during the Tsarist times, but certainly in the Soviet era, time and again, the Russian citizen, an individual, could be asked to do something by the powers that be, and this thing that they would be asked to do would go against everything that individual believed in. They would basically seek out the person who would least want to do the thing that they were being asked to do because of their expertise, like the architect being asked to destroy the building. And when the government apparatus asked the individual to do this thing that goes against their nature, that is a betrayal of what they love, a betrayal of their own integrity, when they're asked to do that, they basically have a minute to make a decision. And the decision is, do I betray my love of architecture, my love of history, my devotion to it, and do what the government's asking me? Or do I refuse on principle? And in so doing, put not only myself at risk, but my family. So this is kind of the decision that you were faced with in that moment. Now, more often than not, the Russian citizens would capitulate, because they had the courage to survive their own imprisonment, their own death. But as I say, you were putting at risk also your children, your nephews, your nieces, your mother, and so you would capitulate. But very often, what would happen when this capitulation would take place is there would be this little secret act of sabotage, like Baranowski's drawings. Now, we kind of, those of us who know Russian culture know that this happened, for instance, in among the playwrights. You would be told the plays you're writing are not acceptable in the Soviet Union. Go write advertising copy instead. Your plays will never be produced. And what the playwrights would do is they would write their plays anyway, and they would put them on in their apartments at 2 a.m. with a cast of 6 and 4 people watching. And they might do that 3 times, and that's it. That was the life of the play. And so, again, through this little act of sabotage, they would retain their sense of integrity, prove their devotion to what they were passionate about, and through the little act of faith, sort of crossing their fingers that by doing this little thing, by having this play for this small group of people in the middle of the night, by publishing this poem to a small group, by writing these drawings down, despite the fact of destroying the building, that hopefully this little act will somehow make Russian life better down the road. And that will allow for Russia to be the Russia that I want it to be. Right. This is what that kind of little act of rebellion was about. Now, having said all that, I'm going to roll 10 years forward. Now it's 2008, and at this point, Rules of Civility is coming out, but I'm already thinking about my next book. And I'm planning on writing A Gentleman in Moscow. I was in a hotel in Geneva and recognized some people in the lobby and thought to myself, I saw these people in the hotel last year. And that kind of got me thinking, wow, what would it be like to live in a hotel? And upstairs in the hotel room, I began sketching the outline for A Gentleman in Moscow. Now, I'm an outliner. Authors work in different fashions, but I'm an outliner. So when I have an idea, like A Gentleman in Moscow, a man gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time, I will spend a year or more designing the book in my mind, imagining the various scenes and scenarios and events. And then I'll start to outline it in a very detailed form. And that takes more than a year for me to complete. Where the outline for Gentleman in Moscow had every chapter, all the events, all the settings, the characters and their backgrounds, some of thematic elements, some of the imagery, some of the dialogue. But in the end, my outline might be 50 pages long before I start writing chapter 1. So when I sit down to write A Gentleman in Moscow around 2012, I have this outline ready to go. Now, as I say, a lot in that outline reflects a lot of decisions that I've already made, things that I know. But of course, as I'm writing, there are things that I have not fully visualized yet. And there are other things that are evolving over the course of the creation of the story and being adjusted and added to it and fixed in some cases. But nonetheless, for those who have not read Gentleman in Moscow, I'm going to sort of sketch a little element here, which is going to become important, which is that there is a character. You have the Count. He's sentenced to house arrest in this luxury hotel and spends 32 years in the hotel across the street from the Kremlin, basically. But he has a childhood friend. And I know he's going to have this friend called Mishka. And I know in the outline and in my thoughts that Mishka is going to be sort of a troubled, temperamental pacer of a figure. An idealist, not very socially adept, as it were, not very good with the ladies. But that's the kind of figure he's going to be. And he and the Count are friends as young men. And when the revolution is coming, he is one of the members of the intelligentsia and the sort of moderately upper class who backs the revolution. And there were a lot of those in Russia. And I know he's going to back the revolution. And when it occurs, he's going to be excited, filled with the idealism of that era, of all the good things that are going to happen in Russia because of getting rid of the Tsar and ending sort of the peasant lives of, in essence, people who are living lives of serfdom. So he's going to be excited about that. He's going to be a part of he's a poet. He's going to be sort of a part of this new generation of Soviet idealists. I know that he's going to eventually start to get disillusioned, that then he's going to do something which upsets the government and he's going to pay a terrible price. As I say, I know all of this. But what I didn't really know, even when I thought the outline was done, is what was the thing that he was going to do that was really going to annoy the government later in his life once he's become disillusioned. This happens like 2/3 the way through the book. So I've written 2/3 of the way through the book, and I get to this moment. And it's now time to describe what he does that annoys the government. And I write a lot of material and I don't like it. And I write another, he's in a committee meeting and says some outrageous things. And I was like, it doesn't work. And they did another thing and I throw that out. And so I'm struggling with this. And so what you do, what I think many writers do is you go for a run, go for a walk, have a drink, go to a bar, but take a break. And then sometimes when you do that, it kind of presents itself suddenly, unexpectedly, a solution. And that's what happened here. I think I was actually pacing in my house at the time. And what ended up happening was I was like, all of a sudden I was like, I know what Mishka is going to do that really, that gets him into trouble. He's going to be the guy who's editing the collected letters of Chekhov. And he's going to be asked to remove that sentence about the bread in Germany from the collected letters. And he's going to do it, and then he's going to regret it, and he's going to cause a big, kerfuffle about it, and he's going to end up paying a terrible price. And when I had this idea, I immediately go to my computer, and I sit down at my desk and turn around, because in my filing cabinet behind me, I could pull out the actual Xerox of that Chekhov letter that I had seen a little bit more than 20 years before. And this is the way, as I say, so to give you sort of a flavor for how kind of these layers of personal experience or of observations can sort of accumulate and express themselves ultimately into a narrative that I'm writing. Now, having said all that, I'm going to tell you something at the end, another story, but in between, I'd love to respond to any questions that you have about anything.
Thanks, Amor. I was going to ask you how you choose the, two of your novels are in a somewhat similar historical era. Your new one, I think, coming out in the fall is a different era. What has to be right about a historical moment for you to say, okay, I want to spend a year or more writing a novel, and every day I want to wake up and sort of live in that moment. But I think you sort of answered the question, because for A Gentleman in Moscow, there is so much upheaval and drama. It's sort of clear why the novelist would want to put a novel in that moment, right?
Yes, I think, but I mean, it's a very good question. And I think the way I think about history my first book is 1938. The second book is 1922 to 1954. So because of the span, my new novel is set in 1954 in America and takes place over 10 days. And so there is a sort of shiftingness to it, and I will write a book in the 70s at some point, set in the 70s at some point. But, but why do I end up in these moments in time? I'm not always sure myself. I get more clarity on that as I'm finishing a work. But so before I talk about Lincoln Highway and how I end up in 1954, let me tell you about my sort of view about history, which is that in my work, and that is that for me, the historical moment that I'm writing in is for me the equivalent of an opera, the backdrop of an opera, like this. This behind me is from an old play, an old piece of canvas painted on that was in the backdrop of a high school play in like the 1920s or something like that, But it's a drop, right? Is that for me? That's, if you think of an opera set, for those of you who go to opera or like opera, I mean, it's not that different in the theater world. You have this painted thing in the very back, which isn't very exact. It doesn't need to be very exact. It's a part of an illusion. And so it has to have just enough color and detail and using the tricks of the Renaissance to give you a sense of depth that it looks like the back of a building or the countryside or whatever else. Now, in the front of that, we then have on the stage things which are more three-dimensional. Now, they may be fake too, right? Like the storefront has only the one side painted on it. And when you go through the door, there's nothing on the other side. And then you have like a chair, which is actually a chair. You sort of have these layers of reality as you're moving closer to the audience. And for me, writing a novel is very much like that. The historical component is that, which is that it needs to be, it can be a little fanciful. It can be a little impressionist. It can be, but it is an illusion. It has just enough detail to situate you as the viewer or as the reader, as you pay attention to the stuff that's happening on the stage. Now, as I get closer to the interaction of the characters, the chair has to look more like a chair, but and less like a sketch. But of course, much like an opera composer or a playwright, I'm far more interested in what the characters have to say to each other and what they're feeling and what they're going through than this stuff in around the circumference. And so for me, that's kind of the way in which I integrate history into my work. Now, my new book that Clay mentioned, The Lincoln Highway, which comes out in October, that's an advertisement, I guess. But the new book, as I say, takes place in 10 days, and it's about 3 18-year-old boys and an 8-year-old boy who are on their way from Nebraska to New York City over the course of 10 days in June of 54. Now, I don't know why that date or why that time or why that whatever, but as I say, and I've written the whole book, I'm now copy editing. And so now I have a little bit more perspective on it. And after finishing it, I kind of went back and began to look at that moment in time, this 10 days in June 1954, and what happened. And by the way, that's what I always do. If I'm going to do research for a book, I do it after I write the first draft. I don't like to do it before I write the first draft because I find that applied research can weigh down a book. But once I've written something, I'll go do some research and just to sort of figure out how far off I am, that kind of thing. So I went back and I looked at, what happened in these 10 days in 1954 in America? And now, instinctively, I think that in retrospect, one of the things that I like about this moment in time in 1954 is that it's not because a lot of things were happening, it's because a lot of things were about to happen. June of 1954 is kind of like a trough in America. In 1929 to 39, you have the Depression. It's extraordinary economic upheaval. Then you have the Second World War, this global conflict. They're kind of mashed together in a way. This incredible 15-year period of disruption in America of both economic and political and family life that's taking place. And you get to the 50s, and it's a time of peace. The Korean War is over by June of 54. The Vietnam War is 10 years off into the future. It's a time of economic prosperity, as we all know. But what's about to happen is that, well, first of all, the first rock and roll song came out in 1954. So picture what's about to happen there. Over the course of the next 15 years, not only is rock and roll going to sweep America and the world, but more importantly, youth culture, for the first time, is going to have its own voice. And it's going to completely change the way in which teenagers exist, not only in America, but around the world. The civil rights movement that we know and think about, the most important events of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, start to occur shortly after 54. The protests, the Rosa Parks, the sitting at the counters, Martin Luther King. This is all coming very hot on the heels of the mid-50s. The sexual revolution, the pill shows up. Playboy magazine is about to be published for the first time. And so that, is going to change everything. The pill, of course, can change the way in which the control women have over their bodies and the ability of young couples to be intimate without fear of having to launch a family, and all these kinds of things. So that's about to happen. So as I say, one of the things I like about this moment in 1954 is not for all the things that were going on. It's for all the things that aren't going on quite yet, but they're right there around the corner. And so, I kind of like that percolating thing. And I'll sort of do one last little point about this. I apologize, but so as I was kind of looking through all these things that happened in that 10 days that kind of reaffirmed my feelings, I run across a little article. And the article says that a company that is in the data analysis business, I can't remember their name right now, but they take big mainframes and cloud computing, and they download millions and millions of pieces of data and sort through them to draw conclusions or find insights. And they sell this commercially to corporations and scientists and what have you. Well, to show the capabilities of their software and of their science, they took all the newspapers that were printed in the United States from 1900 to 2000, every article, and they scanned them and absorbed them in total. And then what they began to do is they began to ask, well, what are the most eventful days in American history, which you can kind of figure out by the volume of commentary on things that are happening, right? So like, obviously, like, Pearl Harbor is an enormously eventful day, which generates news stories in every possible way, not only on that day, but then for repercussions for days. And you can kind of see that by going back and looking over this data. Well, when they finished, they said, hey, here's a question. What's the least eventful day in the last 100 years of America, in the 20th century? And the answer was, it was one of the 10 days in which my book takes place in June of 1954. And I was like, that's perfect.
That's great, because I mean, your reader knows, if they know their history, at least they know what is about to happen.
Yes.
But that brings in so much sort of poignant innocence. The reader knows what's about to happen, but of course your characters don't, because they can't read the future. So
yes,
it's a great place for novelists to be.
And obviously that's a great observation, Clay. I'm going to steal it. And but it is that fits with being 18 years old, I think. Which is because that's 18 years oldness in its way, right? Which is having the innocence, not knowing exactly what's coming. We as parents have a little bit better sense of what the kids are about to go through, but they're at that moment where they have all the innocence, all the idealism, some of the anxiety. And in a way, I think that's what the whole country, America, was kind of like, in a way, and I'm just making this up on the spot here, but America was like a teenager in 1954. So yeah, there's something like that too.
Yeah. So we have a question from Connie McNabb. She asked whether you got a chance to watch the Ken Burns documentary about Hemingway. It just came out, so
I've just started it. I'm a fan of Burns for sure. I'm a fan of Hemingway.
Yeah. So she wants to know how your writing process compares to Hemingway.
Yeah, I don't think I've gotten to the part where I haven't gotten to that part. So, I know a little bit about Hemingway's writing process. But I'll tell you about mine, and the main things are. I think, like many, I'm an outliner, as I say, and not all novelists are outliners, but I am. I'm a very detailed reviser, and in the same way that Hemingway would have been. I'm slower than Hemingway. I'm asked for Penguin Classics. I'm doing the foreword, the introduction for the new edition of The Sun Also Rises, his first novel, and he wrote the first draft of that in something like 6 months. I wish I was like that. I don't write that fast. But he writes standing up, they say, he likes to talk about that, but I'm a morning writer. And I think that I find that's the most recurring thing. If I look back at letters, memoirs, I talk to my peers in the field. All of us tend to do a lot of our best work first thing. You're trying to get as much down before a single external thought interferes with your imagination, whether that's the problems of daily life or the news, God forbid, Twitter or email. You're really just trying to take the blank slate of the morning and get as much done as possible before the world crowds in. And I do operate in that fashion. Drinking, not as much as Hemingway, but I do like a little bit. At the end of the day, But yeah, that tends to work. And then I am, as I say, I'm a reviser. Another thing I think that I share with Hemingway, I seem to remember from reading these letters, is that I don't share my work until it's done. So, I don't hand out chapters either to my editor or my agent or even my spouse. I really wait until I've got something complete before I seek the input or feedback from anybody else.
Yeah. Sounds wise. So Alexander Van de Kamp says, I love the incorporation of literary voices and books in A Gentleman in Moscow, such as the book of Montaigne's essays. How did you come up with the Count's literary obsessions in this novel?
Yeah, some of it I think is more broadly, in imagining the Count, I knew he was going to be someone sort of a 19th century sensibility. And you then start to dial into that. Well, what does that mean? And, I knew he's kind of a sentimentalist, and he loves high art, but he's also a sentimentalist. And so that puts in more in the Anna Karenina camp the brothers Karamazov camp as an example, for those of you who know the Tolstoy versus the Dostoevsky, right? He's not as interested in the tortured soul novel. He loves the tragic love story, but he understands, he appreciates the highfalutin language in either case. Much in the same way, his love of Tchaikovsky and the Nutcracker, that's sort of perfect fit for him. It is profoundly Russian. It is beautiful 19th century classical music, but it is also sort of sentimental and imaginative at the same time. Montaigne is kind of an interesting one in the case of the book, because what I knew is that I had this notion that he would have a book that his father really loved, and that, his father is kind of a more serious figure. And so that he'd have to, and like that's what he finds himself reading in the early days of confinement. And sort of, finally, I'm going to read this book that my dad always admired. And then he's going to be worn down by it, and be like, do I have to read this? And I think the whole thing started with the notion that the bureau in his new room would only have 3 legs. And that eventually this book that he had the ambition to read would be holding up the bureau. Like that was kind of the idea I had. But I didn't know what the book was. And so then you kind of go through your own library and you're thinking about things and what would his father really like, and then I, kind of going across my own spines, I'm like, oh, Montaigne, perfect, and it's perfect for a number of reasons, right? It's this serious sort of 19th century father who, is an intellectual, member of the aristocracy, would have read Montaigne for sure. And the Russians all read French, the great French thinkers, and spoke French, for more than they spoke Russian, in fact. And so that made sense. And then the height, it had to be big enough to hold up the bureau, and I love that, and it's essays, right? And so I thought, that's going to be great because we're going to talk about him reading one, and that's an achievement. But oh my God, there's hundreds of them, for God's sake, And so that I made the commitment. And then what happens is, and like this is the way it often works in the creative process, is as I start to write about it, I then have to go back and read some Montaigne. And then what happens is suddenly you're reading through Montaigne, kind of just to sort of get yourself back up so you can describe it a little bit. And you land on something like, oh my God, what this notion that Montaigne says is perfect for the novel. It belongs here in the novel. And so there are a couple of Montaigne's maxims that appear in the course of the novel. I think most importantly when the Count is giving advice to Sophia, the young Sophia, and says that, something to the effect of that the surest sign of wisdom is a life of humor or happiness, or however it's put. And as I say, that kind of, I discovered that having already committed myself to Montaigne, and there it was, and I was like, oh my God, that's perfect for the Count. It's just the kind of guy he would be. That maxim would speak to him. Yeah.
Well, it's so nice to know that literary considerations don't have to be sullied by practical ones, like whether his essays are big enough to hold up that table. It's a really nice.
That's the secret. Point. That's the way you should make these decisions.
Right. So we've got another question. Katie Flato would like to know if there are any plans to turn A Gentleman in Moscow into a movie.
It's in the works. Kenneth Branagh has signed on to star as the Count. Apple is in the production, would be, created by Apple and distributed by Apple. We do not have a screenplay yet. And so there's a team working on that. But if all goes well in the coming weeks, then they will have a screenplay that everybody signs off on and things will start to move forward. If they don't agree on that screenplay, then you could be in drift mode, and we could be in drift mode for a long time. But so we'll see.
Right. That's drift mode is standard living mode in Hollywood. So that's correct. Yeah. Sally McGee would like to know if the colorful Texas general in the novel is based on a personal acquaintance.
No, he is made up. He is made up. And I was kind of like, how did I decide he was a Texan? He's he is Dickie Vanderweil's boss. When Dickie Vanderweil is the character, he's also a character who rules of civility, as it turns out. But yes, when he shows up, he's a young officer and is kind of the attaché to this military, this general. And obviously the Americans and the Russians were allies during the Second World War. So there was a lot of interaction at that time. And I sort of had this notion, I wanted him to be, there was a sort of idea that the young girl was going to release geese on the floor of the hotel, and there was going to be mayhem. And I wanted this real practical, minded American military figure to come in and solve the problem by breaking the neck of a goose, and scaring everybody on the floor, and so, or about to break the neck of a goose. And it just, Texan made perfect sense to me. Just, it seemed like the right kind of guy. Sort of an ex-Ranger type.
Well, us Texans, thank you for that. So last question from our audience. Marilyn Mole would like to know if you could tell us who among your contemporary novelists do you most respect?
Ooh. I'm not going to say that, right? And this is a genuinely true. I shouldn't even say this, but this is true. I read more dead writers than living writers, and there's a very simple reason why, and that is that, I love Anne Patchett both as a person and a writer. I love Richard Russo both as a person and a writer. And so there are many. I think Colson Whitehead's an extraordinary writer, I both know and admire many of my peers. But here's the way I think about it, for better or worse, and that is, time, to me, history is not good at capturing all that is excellent in art. It is not good at that. And so if we look back to the 19th century, there are hundreds, thousands of writers, musicians, composers, painters who have disappeared from the historical record, and we will never know them or their works, despite the fact that they are geniuses. That is a fact. But while history is not very good at capturing all that is great in art, it is very good at casting off all that is mediocre. And so when we look back, maybe even 50 years is enough, but let's say 75 or 100. What has survived this filtering process such that it is still of interest to the reading public, of stirring the imagination of other artists, is part of conversation? Anything that can do that, over time, over an extended period of time of 50 plus years, then probably it is built in such a way that it has a level of excellence. In the case of a novel, that means a richness of components that allow us that stirs our thoughts and the imagination, and that can do that for multiple different people of different backgrounds. And over time, there are works that are timeless and universal. There are novels that are timeless and universal, like some of the ones we've talked about today. And that's what I'm interested in reading, because I learn the most by reading those books. But it is hard to take the current flow of narratives and know which ones those are going to be. So while I will read contemporary novels for pleasure, most of my reading is for work, and that is to try to understand how to write effectively and what the novel can achieve and what are the ways in which you can achieve it. And in order to do that, I do spend a lot of time in the 50 years and back zone. And so some of those people have only died recently. Toni Morrison's extraordinary. I think Philip Roth is amazing. And I learn a great deal from them. But I certainly have read the figures of the 20s and the turn of the century and the 19th century writers as well. Yeah.
So you said that you wanted to sort of tell us another story, right?
Yeah, I just want to tell you, one other quick story. Again, it's sort of give you a vision of a sense of how crazy things that happen in the way in which events can percolate up through creative material. So you have to go back. I'm a kid in this story, 8 years old, 9 years old, something like that. And my family spends the summer on an island off the coast of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard. And as a boy, I was there, and I put a note in a bottle and threw it out in the ocean. And the note said something like, "Dear whoever finds this bottle, I hope that the bottle has made it to China." And that says something about me, include my address, et cetera, and off it goes. Now, weeks go by and we go home, and after Labor Day weekend, and you have that thing where you come home from your vacation and the mail is all stacked up, and I remember vividly my mother going through the mail, and suddenly she stops and there's a letter this big, tight, And she says, there's a letter for Amor. It's addressed to Master Amor Towles. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, and it's from the New York Times. And I'm like, yeah, give me my mail. So I take the letter, and it turns out that the guy who found the bottle I threw in the ocean, his name is Harrison Salisbury, was an executive editor of the New York Times. Now, Salisbury was the American correspondent in Hanoi. I'd been a big World War II correspondent. And eventually, later in life, he came back and he created the New York Times' op-ed page and oversaw that for a long time until his retirement. And so he is the one who found the letter. He said, "Dear Amor, I'm sorry to say your letter did not make it to China. It made it to me." But so we began to correspond. We corresponded from the time I was 8 to the time I was 18. And then we met in person. He's died years ago, but he was a man of great stature and an aristocratic figure in his own right, and a great intellect, and this incredible world figure of the world. So anyway, I was writing General Moscow. I wrote the first draft, and then, like I implied earlier, once the first draft is done, I like to do a little bit of research about the times and places. Once I've already done my imaginary work is done. And so a big part was I decided, okay, I'm going to go live in the Metropole Hotel. I'd never even been inside when I wrote A General Moscow. And I'm going to go move in with my first draft. And I'm going to bring with me firsthand accounts of things that happened in the hotel by various people I could find. And then I'll read those firsthand accounts and begin to edit my manuscript inside the walls of the hotel. So that's what I did. And as I was gathering firsthand accounts of events in the hotel, and there are many to be found because the hotel was so famous in Moscow. But it was particularly easy to find firsthand accounts by journalists, because the bar at the Metropole was the drinking hole for the American British journalists from the Revolution through the Cold War, half a century's worth of drinking in that bar. So I began gathering, looking at who are the Moscow correspondents in England and America, and from the different newspapers, and did they write a memoir, and did they mention the Metropole? Yes, they did. And so I'm going through this, and I began to Xerox them to take to Moscow, and I'm looking at one of them, and the first thing the guy says is, he says, "Oh, I was at the bar with Salisbury," and I was like, "Oh my God, I completely forgotten." Of course, Harrison Salisbury was the Moscow correspondent for the New York Times. He was the bureau chief right after the Second World War and in the early years of the Cold War. So I immediately did a search, and of course he wrote a memoir about it. I didn't have it. So I bought it through secondhand bookstores or whatever, and I get it and I carry it with me to Russia. And so I'm sitting in my suite in the Metropole Hotel, and I got his book on the desk, and I open it up, and the first thing he says on page 1 is, I climbed, leaving the airport, I climbed in the taxi and said, "Take me to the Metropole Hotel." Because it turned out that Salisbury lived at the Metropole the whole time he was in Russia. So now, of course, I read the whole thing. And there are nice, lovely little details that he had observed in the 50s in Russia from his standpoint. And I integrated some of those into the section in the 50s towards the end of the book. And having done that, kind of revised the book with these little couple of things from him, I was like, you know what? He deserves to be in it. What am I thinking? So Salisbury is actually a named person in the book. They talk about the American journalist Salisbury. And I knew that the Count at some point was going to need a fedora, a disguise for a particular critical moment at the end of the book. And I was like, his disguise is going to be the trench coat and fedora of Harrison Salisbury. And so that's what happens. He steals Salisbury's trench coat and hat from the coat room at the Metropole and uses that as his disguise. And this was a great pleasure to me to be able to weave this man into my story who had shown such graciousness and kindness to me as an 8-year-old boy.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's that. Thank you for coming today, and thanks, Clay, for having me.
Yeah, no, that's so amazing. Fate is so wonderful in that way. Well, thank you for being a part of things. I just also want to thank you all, our donors, for attending. Thank you for supporting the festival so strongly. Thanks also to the McNabbs and the Seeligs for being our honorary co-chairs, and all of our event committee members. You can pre-order The Lincoln Highway, which Amor told you about, his fall novel, at nowherebookshop.com. Nowhere Bookshop is the festival's independent bookseller. It's a new bookstore in San Antonio. And I want to really encourage you to attend the book festival this weekend. There are a lot of great conversations happening, and we are here to say this weekend that great ideas and books and book culture is going to thrive during this pandemic. So please attend, and we'll see you there. Thank you for attending.